Hello and welcome to the BYU Library Family History webinar. We're glad you could join us today. My name is Olivia Tuller and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on October 5th with Catherine Grant. She will be giving a presentation on getting to know the person page and family tree. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from Peggy Ryskamp, who will be giving a presentation on finding new insights in old records. Before we begin, here's a little bit about Peggy. Peggy Ryskamp first became intrigued with the contents of a Spanish parish book over 30 years ago, and has since worked in repositories ranging from local parishes to provincial and national archives. With her late husband George, she has co-authored 2 books and mentored students in archives throughout Spain and France. She enjoys sharing her enthusiasm for Spanish language records in the classroom and has taught family history classes at the university level and lectured at multiple classes and institutes. Beyond spending time with her 19 grandchildren, she loves Spanish wildflowers, gardening, and dark chocolate. And we'll now turn the time over to Peggy to share her screen if she's ready.
Thank you. Hello, I am really happy to be with you today. It's been a long time since I've actually taught in a conference kind of environment, and I've enjoyed doing it in the past, and it's good to get back to it again. Today we're going, by the way, Olivia said that we would probably answer all of your questions later, but this is a kind of a different kind of a class than a normal conference presentation, in the sense that I'm going to be asking questions that I would love to get your response to. And so if I ask a question, and there will be a lot of them, please feel free to get on your chat and give the answers to Olivia, and she'll give them to me. And I'm trying to make this as informal and relaxed in a sharing environment as we possibly can. I've done this class before. I've called it a different subject. It's not quite this class, but it's very fun. It's a fun topic to share, and your input is going to make it better. So thanks in advance for what you're about to share. My name, as Olivia said, is Peggy Ryskamp. My husband is George Ryskamp. So for many years, George taught family history at BYU, and we would take students with us to Spain and Southern Europe. And that was a wonderful learning experience for me as well as for them. I have great memories of all of that. There is a picture here of me standing in front of an archive with George. All right, so here I am. Here's George, and we will consider the student behind us as a typical representative of all the wonderful students we've taken through the years. This is a picture of not quite the first parish book I ever worked with, but it looked just like it. This book starts in the 1600s, the books that I worked in. George had been working for many years already for clients before I started working with him. And so I jumped the first parish I ever went to. I worked in the 1700s, and George was tutoring me. And at first I felt very overwhelmed, but gradually, in fact, quickly, I began to really enjoy the world that I was in, that I was viewing. I was meeting people. I nearly always would do the baptism records, especially at the beginning while George did the marriage records. And I would see these families building, and I would see these children coming, and I would see meet these women in a way. At the time, I had my own young children that I was missing terribly. And it was very easy for me to identify with those women and to identify with, and I began to have questions. Because I'd identified so much with the women, I began to have questions about their world versus mine, because I assumed that their emotions were the same, but how did their world differ? And I started asking myself so many questions. And I just sort of began to conceptualize these people in my mind. And so I one day decided, okay, I'll do what I always do when I have questions about Spanish genealogy. I'll talk to George. So I wrote down all my questions. And one night when we had some free time, I said, okay, I just want to talk to you about all these questions that I've had. And I rattled them all off about the clothes and about the timing of things and just all these questions. And he said, I don't know. I've never thought of it before. And it entirely shocked me that George didn't know something about Spain or family history. And we decided together that what I was going to do was I selected a place and a time period. I realized I couldn't put together all of Spain and I couldn't do all of time, but I could select a time and a place. So I zeroed in on the time and the place that I was working on, which at that time was Garganta La Olla in Cáceres, Spain, which is in Extremadura over on the western side of Spain, and between 1750 and 1800. This is a picture that we took on one of the first trips I was ever over there. It's an old picture, you can tell by just the photography of it, but it also looked very much like it's easy to look at this picture and go back 100 years in your mind and realize it probably had looked like that for a long, long time. Lots of divided little tiny plots of land terraced across this big hillside, and every family in town had a little plot or a large plot on the other side of the river where they grew their food. And so I realized that the best thing to do was to make my questions as specific as possible. And I also began to realize as I continued to research that asking some questions opened up my mind to other questions. And it was good to let myself do that and have these questions in my mind as I was working, because one question would lead to another insight that I probably would not have grasped if I had not been asking myself questions as I went. About this time, I read the book by David Hackett Fisher called Albion Seed, where he analyzes 3 settlements in the United States. But the way he uses for his analysis is he talks about folkways. And they're different ways to look at a specific time and a community. I was fascinated by the book, and I've enjoyed over the years when I've talked to people about their research, asking them about naming ways in the country and the place where they're working. It's usually a very fascinating thing to do because it gives even students, beginning students, a sense of, oh my goodness, I know more than I realized I knew. I've been reading records looking for names, dates, and places, but along the way, I'm learning other things. And one of the questions that I always ask them is, what naming ways have you noticed in the area in which you're working? I thought if anyone would like to jump in on chat, if you're brave, if you would like to just send an answer to Olivia, she'll be checking for them. And in the meantime, I'll tell you kind of a fun story that one of the students told one day when I was talking to them. And she said that the family she was working with had named their children for a lot of qualities, or like patience and hope and words that carried a meaning to them. And that in this particular family, when child, I believe it was number either 10 or 11 was born, the name for that child was Sufficient, which I thought was a great story and a great name. I know that a lot of different countries and different communities, one of a typical naming way is to name the oldest son after perhaps the paternal grandfather and the next son after perhaps the maternal grandfather. You get a lot of times when you look at a family, you'll be able to know that you're on the right track with that family, because you will see some of the same names that you've recognized from a previous generation coming in. Another one that people often bring up is the fact that sometimes in a family you will see at least 2 children with the same name. And generally what this means is that the child who carried that name previously was deceased by the time this next child was born that they gave that name to, which is a sad thing to see happen, but also kind of gives you a sense of a time and a place that's very different than ours, and gives you an understanding of their lives and the emotions that they experienced. Building ways is another one. This is the town of Gargantula Oya. We've taken these pictures, and I love the potted plants in the front. When we very first went there to work, and we would be working in the parish, and never did for quite a while get to go inside of any of the houses, and I always just pictured them as a log cabin but in Spain. In my mind, I was just sort of putting everyone on the ground floor with this fireplace around them. And as you will see later, I began to realize as I continued to study that those houses were very different inside than what they had looked like on the outside, at least what I was perceiving them to be. This is a farmhouse, a combination. This is from the Netherlands, and it's a combination farmhouse in front with barn in the back for the animals. And they've connected the 2 units together to keep both parties warmer. And it's a fascinating concept and very, very common. Religious ways. Almost religion played an important part in their lives, perhaps even more than for many contemporary societies it does. But I've always viewed as the religious ways kind of the scaffolding, that the records produced by religion and religious ways produced the scaffolding of doing family history, particularly in the Catholic countries, the Catholic country of Spain. And it also, I think, provided a lot as you get to know the culture. In many, many cultures, the religion also provides a large amount of the social interaction as well. This is the main church on the left, and it was built really around 1300. And as you can tell, it looks almost like the dirt just the church just came up out of the dirt. They're the same color as the ground beneath it. The church just continues up. Social ways. The social ways are still very much in existence, and they probably have been. The clothes have changed a little bit, but I would imagine the canes, that bench has been there for over 100 years, I would imagine, and the people sitting on it may have changed, but the concept of taking time to visit together and being part of this community is still very much the same. Workways. While many people I've done research, whose research I've done were farmers, my family comes from England, and mine worked in cotton mills. And in the census for my family, rather than having farmer or daily worker, well, I'm seeing things like bleacher and stover and maker up, all of which have something to do with working in a cotton factory. Now, while religion might have varied from community to community and country to country, and while buildings might have varied, one thing is that no matter, everybody ate. And the big question, the fun question to ask is, what did my ancestor eat? And the answer to that is really very simple and easy, that your ancestors would have eaten. Our ancestors ate what our ancestors grew. And it's fascinating to me to watch as I travel from country to country, as I look back at my own family history and my own memories that of my grandparents, that what they ate was what they grew and that was what they knew. Here, a big question to ask would have been, could my ancestors grow an olive tree? If your ancestors could grow an olive tree, that would have changed their life in so many ways. The countries where I've researched the most are countries where you could grow an olive tree. And as a result, that has affected the way first of all, they had olives whenever they wanted them. But more than the olives, they had oil. And they had that oil from the olives gave them of course, oil for food, as well as light. It provided light for the lights that they specifically made that were burned off of an olive oil that they put olive oil in the bottom and then had a wick for them. There you see instances where it's used. The women would dab it around their eyes, sort of as a body lotion. And at one point, if there's time at the end of this, I will do a little bit of a show and tell, but a woman gave me once 2 bars of her soap that she had made. And one of them had fat, regular fat in it. And the other one, she said, this is the soap that you would use for your face because it's made with pure olive oil. And this is the good soap. And her daughter was talking to me the whole time. The mom wasn't saying, this soap is better than anything you can buy in a store wrapped in a piece of paper. So what they grew was what they ate. In France, this is a picture of a cassoulet, which is very famous in southern France. And basically, when you look at that, you see what they grew, what their animals were. And this was daily life. And it was also delicious. In Spain, a very common thing to do would be to take the vegetables from your garden and to add olive oil and vinegar. I was on a house tour once of a house several hundred years old, and they had both a bull's horn, 2 bull's horns, and one had held olive oil and one had held vinegar, and that was what they poured it out of when they cooked. And you put these things together and it makes gazpacho, which is an absolutely wonderful soup to have in the summertime. It's very refreshing, very enjoyable. I would imagine that as you are listening to this, that some of you are thinking of soups or stews or main meals that you or your ancestors made for centuries now. Another one, so while the gazpacho was from southern, is more common in the south of Spain where it is really, really hot. And the north of Spain is much colder. And in the area of Galicia, there's more of it's called a caldo gallego, and it's made with vegetables and potatoes. And it's a good hearty soup in the middle of the winter, which they eat with a bread that weighs about 2 pounds at least per loaf. It's so heavy. It's made of dark, and when you look at this picture of it, you get a sense of it. It's made with dark flour, and so it's just a darker bread than I was ever used to, and it always has this knob on the top. George and I started the very first trip I ever made over there with him. We were too poor to buy anything for a souvenir. But what we did was we bought loaves of bread and we bought a bottle of varnish and a paintbrush, and we varnished bread and took that home with us. It lasted about a year and it was really fun. We had bread from every region of Spain, and it looked like the top of Spain, the bread was darker and heavier, and the further down south you went, the lighter the bread felt and the lighter the flour was. But I asked them once in the bakery why this knob on the bread because it's so significantly a part of pan gallego. And the women answered and said, well, that is what you would use to rip it open. No one had knives yet. We didn't cut. Well, if they did have knives, they weren't using it for the bread. They were using it for other heavier things. But for bread, rather than cut it with a knife, they would just start at the top and take that knob and just rip that at that knob, and it would break the bread apart so that everyone could have some and they could share it without needing to cut it. So you look around the world and think to yourself, what filled my ancestors' bread group? And you have so many choices. I definitely wanted to include some tortillas. I've got naan bread in there. I've got dark black bread from Eastern Europe. I've got French bread. It is quite fun to really think about the fact that almost every culture has some form of a bread group, that there's just this basic need for daily bread, literally. Now, an interesting thing happened because there was this list that I was starting to have in my head, that one day, as we were working up in northern Spain, we actually found a license to bake bread in the notarial records, and it listed the names of the people who were allowed to bake bread in the town that year. We think of bread as something that your mom made or your grandmother made or your great-grandmother made in the United States, and that there's just always been ovens in our houses where we've been able to make that. But in Europe, that was not the case. There were community ovens. And at the community oven, in order to work to sell bread from the community oven, you needed a license to do that. And this is a license from 1755, and it lists the names of the people who are able to bake bread. And it also lists the amount that they need to sell it for and the amount that it should weigh to make sure everyone got a good deal. Now, one day I asked someone along the bread line, I said, well, did everyone then buy their bread? And she said, oh, no, not everyone could afford that. And so the people who couldn't afford the bread made their own masa, their own dough. And there were like 2 afternoons a week where the community oven was reserved for people who needed to come and bake their own bread. And she said her mom would get a big board, put like around 10 loaves of bread, 10 rounds that would turn into bread once she baked it, and put the board on her head because it was easier to carry on her head than it would be walking with it in her arms, and take it to the oven and bake it. I was fascinated. Speaking of bread, very quickly, we've all heard the term upper crust, like the upper crust of society, and that started from the staple of the New England diet was brown bread, and it was wheat flour and cornmeal, and then rye flour and cornmeal, and it produced such a hard crust that the wheat flour became alone. If it was alone, it was reserved for special occasions. Whereas when you mix the rye and the corn in with it, was the daily bread that people ate. So and they would save the top crust just for show, and then the bottom crust would be made with the more hardy grains. And that's where the expression, the top crust of society, the upper crust of society came. They had special stamps and seals for special occasions or special bakeries or for special people that they would use these stamps to stamp their bread. And another fact I like about bread is that there was actually a prayer that they would say for the yeast to make the bread rise when they would bake it. And I loved that. Now, sometime, if you get a chance and I get a chance to meet you, there's another class I teach where we kind of talk about bread as well. And I actually bring loaves of bread and we passed out samples, which we could not do today, but another time, another place, I would love to do that with you. Okay, having asked all these questions, now the next step to do is to just be as creative as you can as you search for and you read and you evaluate what you're looking for, what you want to know. Always have a dictionary, and I would suggest that the older you get that dictionary to be, the better off it will be. I would like to say for all the Spanish speakers that the Real Academia has a collection online and of dictionaries that go, they'll give you the definitions for, like in the 1700s, the 1600s, they'll show it in phrases. And if you do capital RAE, capital NTLLE, that should give you those dictionaries. Not many people traveled earlier than today. And so old travel logs were a very popular way for people to learn about other places. And people who traveled actually were in a way celebrity. Mark Twain wrote a lot about his travels. Local histories. This is a local history produced by the school teacher about Garganta La Olla. Other towns, their local libraries should have things. It's a good place to begin, and fortunately, because of online, there's so much more available than there used to be, and you can find things online instead of needing to actually go to the town itself. And then you can always Google and get pictures as well. Cookbooks. A local cookbook for the time period is so fun as a way to get a sense of what they were actually eating. I think I had a collection of them when I cleaned out George's office. All of our grandchildren ended up wanting a lot of them when they got books. Those were the books that they wanted to go for because they thought they were so fascinating. And one thing all older cookbooks have in common is that they're very loose on their description of how long to take, how much to put in of an ingredient, and how long to cook it. It just kind of depended, I think, on what worked for you, but it would give you at least what the ingredients were. Regional histories as well as local histories is a good one. City directories is a United States source, but it's very, very helpful. There's something fun about being able to look up your grandparents or your great-grandparents and see where they lived at a certain time, or maybe the business that one of them had. Military records can be a good source for interesting details. This is a military record from Melitón González Trejo, who was born in 1844. And his height was 1.664 meters, which translates to 5.4959 feet. So you get a sense of how tall he was. And it's interesting because some of the descriptions of him describe him as tall. And we would not necessarily think today of a male of 5'5" being tall, but there was a different height going at that point. Journals. I was in a group the other day and someone was commenting how much they appreciated the people in the past who took time to write in their journals. And by inference, this concept that a journal is a very, very valuable thing, the more you can put in a journal, the better it is. Let's just leave it at that. This is a fascinating book written by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, and it was about a midwife who lived in New England, and from 1785 to 1812, she made an entry practically every day. They were never long. They were never more than a couple of lines, but she was very conscientious and regular, consistent in what she did. And through that, this professor was able to flesh out these families in her little community through other records. and actually give a lot of background for the very few lines that Martha Ballard herself had written. I love this French saying, if nothing happens, write to say so. I think that what some people might not consider as they're writing in their journal of any value, later on will become very, very valuable to posterity. This is a fascinating example, a journal example of food waste in our family. My grandmother my grandmother's journals went to my mother and then to my sisters, and they were reading, and they realized where she had friends over. It was another busy day, and she had a study class, and the ladies all came, and then she wrote, we served egg on toast, and it was perfect, and also served cocoa. And so my sisters and I talked with them about it, and we were all saying, really, you would serve egg on toast with all these people over? And that was a big deal. Okay, that was perfect. And so what did that mean? When we talked to my mother, she remembered that what egg on toast meant is that it would be a white cake covered with cream, and then you would take a half of a peach slice, a canned peach slice, and put on top of it. And that is what it was. That together, that peach slice on the white would look like an egg, and so it would be like egg on toast on that piece of cake. And in fact, when my mother had her 80th birthday, we served egg on toast for dessert, and it was very fun. Everyone enjoyed making their own version of it with the whipped cream and the canned peaches. That you notice this journal entry is dated the 14th of January, 1944, which was straight in the middle of the war. And they had been rationing for a long, long time. And so you can imagine that by then, egg on toast with cake and cream and a canned peach would have tasted perfect for them. Another thing that brought to mind is that I have lately come across a collection of old government posters, and one of them from the United States in the 1940s says, "Can all you can," with the addition, "It's a real war job." And it makes you realize that that's really literally what my grandmother was doing, was she was canning those peaches that they had on that. They were not fresh. They had been canned. And that was how they were making do during the war. So sometimes we still can today, but I think it's fun. Actually, this is a pretty recent picture. The biography said I like gardening, and I do. And I'm a little ready to be done with peach canning right now, but there's something I like about it. I enjoy that there is a sense of my mother, my grandmother, well, my mother didn't really can, but my grandmother and her friends, and going back in time and just being able to preserve the fruits of the earth like so many people in our family lines have done, and that tastes better. Another source is time period catalogs. This one gives you anything on this page for 2 cents and gives you an idea of times and what they had and what they cost. We came across a book specific to Spain about architecture. And from that, I was able to realize that on the first floor, just like in the Netherlands, there's a space on the first floor to put the animals, and the kitchen, actually, in those houses that I was looking at in Garganta all this time, the kitchen was on floor number 3, so that all of the hot, smoky air from the fire could go out through the tiles instead of building up in the house. Non-population schedules. If you can get one for a foreign country, they're fabulous. If you can get one for the United States, it's not a population schedule, but it will tell you things like farm equipment and animals, and just give you a sense of general life beyond people and places and names. And this does an excellent job of that with Garganta. I particularly like this one that talks about the fact that there's no cemetery because it's not necessary, because they bury everybody in the parish church, which I had not even known to recognize was a possibility until I went to the church and I actually saw this for myself. Notarial documents, legal documents. We had known this person through parish records, but we never knew his profession until we read about him in his will. Here you have a marriage contract between this woman and her son. Well, this woman saying what she is giving to her son at the time of his marriage. And you can see as you look at it, all the things that are covered and how very specific it is and what an understanding of life it gives you. Now that you have done this research, this comes, I think, is the fun part, is to take what you have learned and put it together or organize it or try to figure out, try to see what you can do to answer questions that you've got. Like, for example, what you can use your traditional sources, even just parish records, or like we just learned from a journal. Make these traditional records can work harder. I asked the question, here is a parish record that gives an example of a death that I did not even understand had happened the way it had until I was home from the archive and putting it all together. But you notice here that this woman named Maria Angela Lopez has 2 children, and I knew that she had twins because they were right next back to back in the parish records. I honestly hadn't noticed the dates. This is an archive only open 4 hours, and you just are writing furiously the whole time without too much analysis. But I had not put together that one baby was born on the 29th and the other baby was born on the 30th. And what I really didn't put together until I more carefully read the record was that at the time of their baby's baptism, which was on the 2nd of May, so two days after the 30th of April, on that day was the baptism of the babies. And by that point, Maria Angela had passed away. So sometime between the 30th of April and the 2nd of May, she passed away. And I am fascinated at this little mini history that is available just within a simple parish baptism book. And yet the poignancy of what is explained in that record. I had the question of how many children were baptized of necessity, and that if the baby looked like it was going to be in danger of dying, they would sometimes baptize it at the time. Well, they would baptize it at the time it was born if they thought the baby was not going to survive, because it was important that the baby was baptized before it passed away. And so that fact kind of gives you an idea of what childbirth was like, what life was like at that time. And so I thought it would be an interesting statistic for this time period. And we had someone help us with the computer angle of putting this together several years ago, but they analyzed the records, and we realized that of 1,951 births, 386 of them had the baby baptized of necessity. That does not mean all of them died. In fact, a lot of times it's wonderfully fun to read a child who is baptized of necessity, who gets married and has 7 or 8 children of their own. And that's always gratifying, but it is an interesting statistic, and it does give you a sense of the mortality rate at that point in this time period in the 1700s. Another question that I was fascinated with was, what months did most marriages take place? And then there was a second question was why, but I just was curious to know. I hadn't really caught a pattern specifically because I hadn't paid attention to the question. But once I started paying attention to the question, and then we looked at the data and realized that a high percentage of marriages in Garganta took place in the winter months, which, when you think about it, does make sense because it's an agricultural schedule, and it was an agricultural area. The people were mostly farmers, and their life revolved around their fields. And so when there was nothing growing in the fields, that would be the time to take care of the rest of life, which would include marriages a lot of times. It's an interesting statistic. You've got January and February and November, so many marriages, and in December, only 7. And the reason for that is that the Catholic marriage ceremony consisted of 2 parts, the marriage blessing and the marriage, and then the velation, the blessing. And you could not do the velation during a holy day. And Advent and Lent were holy days. And so because of that, it evidently, fewer people wanted to get married during that time. They would get married either before or after the time of Advent, which is the days before Christmas. I wanted to just take some time now and talk about sewing ways. Sewing ways was one of the ways that David Hackett Fisher discusses. And I love the personalities that come through in sewing. I have to give a disclaimer to be transparent with you. I have upstairs under the bed several sewing projects that have never quite been finished yet of hand stitching that I've done. And maybe that's why I respect all these women who actually stick with it and finish them up. But I love the way, and I appreciate, by the way, any finished items I have in my house that are creative have mostly come from somebody else who I very deeply appreciate. But look at these. I love these 3 women. I love the looks on their faces. They're happy. They're sewing together. My grandmother's journal has entries about when she would sew with her friends in the evenings. I think there's something that it filled a creative need as well as a social need. And it expressed these women and their personalities and their practicalities. And there just says so much. These are pillowcases that my grandmother stitched that have been turned into dolls as memories for us, her grandchildren. These are other photos that came from Spain, and the women loved showing me their sheets, their clothes, their special dresses that they make for fiestas. They are so proud of the stitching, the hand stitching that they have done. And they should be. This is a tablecloth, and it's absolutely stunning. And you just really do see a lot of these women's who they are as they start talking to you about what they've done with their hands and what they've made, what they've grown, what they've cooked. And I love getting to know the insights of her story in history. I know other people have said that statement before, but it just absolutely resonates with me because I have seen it for myself, and I just truly do value it. And for me, it makes the family history that I do so much more enjoyable and so much more rewarding to think of these women and these men and their lives. And as I look at the details, as I ask myself questions and find answers to them, I have my respect for these people grows. I love their genuineness. I love their tenacity. I love their goodness. I love their generosity as you see them giving things to friends and family in their wills. In their cooking, their canning so that their family can survive during hard times and have fruit in the middle of the winter when it doesn't grow in your climate. There is so much about so many good people who are our ancestors as we get to know them. And I just would want to end kind of the way I started. You really don't know what century this woman is in. By the way, it's about 2007 when this picture was taken. She's in front of a building that was built in the 1700s. And so you've got that incredible merging. But I just want to wish you the very best as you're making your discoveries about your ancestors. And I hope that this time together has opened up your thoughts of possibilities of what you want to find and what you can find as you look in new ways in old records. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which is on October 5th with Catherine Grate. She will be giving a presentation on getting to know the person page and family tree. A recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fhl_webinars@byu.edu or follow Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.